Here we are again then, some arcade treasures from 1981. You all seemed to enjoy the 1980 video, which pleases me mightily, so here's some more. Again, the main idea isn't to look at the biggest games, but to find the weirdness and the hits from companies that I'm not likely to cover in full. Generally speaking, I intend to do whopping full arcade retrospectives on folks like Taito, Sega, properly this time, Atari, SNK and the Chicago duo of Midway and Williams. Universal, Cinematronics, Exidy and others though? Well, here's where I can best fit those guys in. We've got 10 games from 1981 here, a big leap in the world of scrolling platformers, a couple of successful bootlegs, more vector goodness including a game that never came out, and naturally there's a couple of games that take a fair bit of inspiration from Pac-Man here. But we begin with a very nice and colourful platformer that, again, seriously pushed things forward. When we saw Alpha Denchi in the 1980 video, they were busy getting a slap on the wrist for creating a ropey Pac-Man clone called Dora-chan that used characters from Doraemon without the manga's publishers having any knowledge of it. Tut tut. And so, here in 1981 we've got something much more impactful, the studio's first well-known and important game, that being Jump Bug, which they made whilst under contracts for Hoei International, who we saw in the 1980 vid with Future Flash. The game itself was then published by Sega in Japan and Europe, and by Rockola in the States, and it's most certainly a damn good one. Actually, there is one thing I should correct quickly. I said in the previous video that Hoei International were a short-lived company that only made a few games in the golden age, but that's not the case. It turns out that Hoei, in 1982, actually became Corland, who made a whole load of games for Sega, and eventually became Banpresto. Whoopsie daisy, missed that one. Anywho, I digress a little. Let's get back to Jump Bug and how bloody good it is. This is one of the earliest arcade games that mostly features forced horizontal scrolling, coming out a few months after Konami's seminal Scramble and its sequel, Super Cobra. Jump Bug does have shooter elements of course, seeing as you can blast the enemies on the screen if you wish, but there's a big twist. You play as a car that's very obviously a Volkswagen Beetle, hence why it's called a bug, and you can jump around all over the place. You can control the height of the jump and how quickly you fall, and ideally you'll land on buildings or clouds or whatever as you go, collecting money bags and jewels, and naturally avoiding any other obstacle that happens to be in your way, spikes, volcanoes and whatnot. As is often the case, details on the creation of Jump Bug are limited, but we do know that Alpha Denchi's main programmer and engineer, Eiji Fukatsu, worked on both this and the earlier Dora-chan. Fukatsu is a very important figure indeed, seeing as when Denchi and SNK officially partnered up later in the decade, he'd be one of the main men responsible for the development of the Neo Geo. We know as well that a guy only known as Kawamura planned Jump Bug, and unfortunately this fellow's full name eludes me, although he apparently previously worked for Data East, creating the 1980 game Manhattan. There's a recent little encyclopedia magazine all about Jump Bug, but it's only in Japanese. One important thing about this game comes with the graphics. Jump Bug features a limited form of parallax scrolling, where the sky is fixed and the clouds move slower than the main scene. It's not as powerful and as complicated as what Takashi Nishiyama would do the following year with Moon Patrol, but it's the first game to feature any kind of parallax. There's a lot of different scenes in the game as well, from the regular buildings to an underwater section, and even a part where you have to make your way up a big pyramid with a little bit of vertical scrolling. Quite a lot of stuff is crammed into the game, which is no mean feat considering that it's actually running on Galaxian hardware. It still looks great now, in all honesty, what with it being so colourful and psychedelic. That, and it's just a damn fun game that's held up in pretty much every regard, one that was rightly a success on its original release, and is absolutely still worth playing now. Go do that if you haven't. The next couple of games take us into the world of bootlegs. There's no prizes for guessing what the biggest game of 1981 was. Hell, it's one we even talked about a bit in the 1980 video. It was, of course, Nintendo's Donkey Kong, the game that changed everything for the Big N, making them one of the biggest forces in the industry single-handedly, and is obviously one of the most influential platformers of all time. Obviously, there'd be a lot of platformers that were immediately trying to get some of that Donkey Kong magic, and there'd be plenty of games that were just trying to utterly rip it off. Here we're looking at one of the more famous Kong clones, and one of the most blatant of them all, that being Crazy Kong, made by a somewhat obscure company called Falcon. There's certainly not a whole lot different about the gameplay. This plays almost exactly like the original Donkey Kong, complete with all the levels, all the enemies, everything. There are, of course, some other differences. The sounds and music are totally different, as is the colour palette. That's all over the shop. And the game asks you, how high can you try, as opposed to how high can you get. If you watched the last video, you may actually recognise some of these sounds. Crazy Kong was originally made using the same hardware as Crazy Climber, hence the name. So why are we even covering this then? Well, the story of Crazy Kong is actually a lot more complex than a company making a bootleg, getting attention for it, and ultimately getting sued. As a matter of fact, Crazy Kong and its sequel, Crazy Kong Part 2, which came out immediately and is virtually the same game only with the colour palette being a lot closer to the original Donkey Kong, isn't really a bootleg as such. I suppose you could call it an official bootleg, because Falcon acted entirely with Nintendo's blessing in Japan. Basically, the demand for Donkey Kong was so freaking massive that Nintendo was struggling to fill it, even in their home country. And so, they allowed Falcon to produce this bootleg, and were actually quite impressed with how close they got. The trouble initially started when other companies started releasing their own clones of Crazy Kong outside of Japan. You've got the likes of Monkey Donkey and Big Kong that we don't even know who the hell made, or versions of Crazy Kong released by the likes of Italian company Zaccaria, the UK-based Alco Electronics, and the US-based Elcon Industries. Again, a large reason for this was because of how high the demand for Donkey Kong was, but none of these companies were acting with Nintendo's approval. Elcon in particular drew the ire of Nintendo of America, who promptly sued their ass and put them out of business. The relationship between Nintendo and Falcon, meanwhile, went sour when Falcon produced a bootleg of Donkey Kong Jr. called Crazy Jr., this time without Nintendo's approval. The Big N put them on blast, and the company's president ended up getting arrested. Eventually, Falcon disappeared from the arcade world in around 1984 or so. So yeah, while bootlegs like this aren't altogether that interesting to play, it is great when they have a cool story surrounding them, like this one does. Of course, it should come as no surprise that the almighty Pac-Man was subject to absolutely tons of clones and hacks, and here I've got one of the more creative and better playing ones. This is Piranha, an American hack made by a company called GL. As far as I can tell, these guys only ever released 2 games, both of which were Pac-Man hacks, and we are actually going to look at the second one in 1982. Anyway, this game, which was published by US Billiards, changes Pac-Man in a very significant way. There's no maze. Instead, the game is presented with you being underwater, playing as a red piranha, and the ghosts have been turned into lethal squids, chasing you around. Also, there's quite a lot more dots to collect. However, all the other walls are the same as normal, with bonus items and, of course, power pellets to eat and use to get your own back on the squids. I quite like this take on the game. The lack of maze actually adds to the challenge, meaning that you've got to be a fair bit more accurate in order to get the loose dots quickly, as opposed to just circling around them, and the increased number of dots makes it generally a much harder game than the Namco original. It seems like Piranha was one of the best received Pac-Man hacks. While it was usually only available as a simple conversion kit, the aforementioned US Billiards release did give it its own cabinet. A decent effort, and it doesn't appear as though anyone got in any trouble for it. Worth playing. Still, Piranha is hardly the strangest take you can find on the Pac formula, not even from 1981. Here we have Streaking, a game from the very obscure Shoei, a company who I think may have been the parent one for Falcon, the folks who released Crazy Con. This isn't a full-on hack, as it's not running on Pac-Man hardware, but it is on Galaxian hardware, so it's certainly part of the legions of Pac clones kicking around and is obviously thoroughly unofficial. This has an even stranger formula. The maze is back, but this time you're playing as a regular woman who starts out completely naked and is getting chased around by cops. There's not too much detail here, so I don't think I need to break out Fred Elliott for this game. Anyway, you must collect the dots, and ideally you also collect the items of clothing whenever they appear. This is intriguing as it changes the visual appearance of your character, with an eventual goal of her becoming fully clothed once again. Still, the main goal is the dots, and there's an odd mechanic here too. There's a fatigue meter, and you need to keep it topped up by collecting the dots, which means you've got to find an ideal path through the maze. If you're good at Pac-Man, you're likelier to lose lives through the fatigue meter running out, as opposed to getting caught by the fuzz. The maze is closed off, so there's no warp passage, and there are no power pellets. However, the 4 big dots in the corners function as teleports to the opposite corner, so they can come in handy. Again, it is an intriguing take on a formula that was already well worn, one that's kind of amusing to find in a sordid little bootleg. That said, it's not like you can really call Streaking an adult game or anything, especially not by today's standards. Perhaps this was much more titillating in 1981, although it's hard to say. It certainly must have had some notoriety at the time. After all, the game is seen repeatedly in a 1983 comedy movie and a Joe Don Baker vehicle called Joysticks, or at least another version of the game called Stripper was in that. A bootleg of a bootleg. It's always cool to go down a rabbit hole with games like this, isn't it? '81 features no end of games inspired by Pac-Man. You could not avert your eyes on the arcade floor from some top-down title that involves a maze and some dots. And so while this takes us a little over 10 games, let's quickly look at a couple more of them. These ones at least are a bit more original as opposed to being hacks and clones. Exidy's Mousetrap is one of the better ones. Here Pac-Man is replaced by a mouse and the ghosts by cats, but you've got a few other twists. There's bones that you can pick up, and they kind of act like power pellets that you store. You hit the button and you become a dog for a short time. There's a hook that you've got to watch out for as they're uninhibited by the maze, switches you can hit that change the maze around, kind of Ladybug style, and cheeses and other items that you pick up for points. It's decent. Good graphics, a maniacal soundtrack, and speedy play. Good dot eating for sure, and this actually got immortalised as one of the games that Buckner and Garcia sang about on the Pac-Man Fever album. Universal Snapjack is definitely one of the odder dot eaters. It's a scrolling title that I guess you could call a cross between Pac-Man and Scramble. Eat the dots as you come across them, and stretch your legs in order to avoid the enemies that are coming at you from all sides. It's a unique idea for sure, although I must say I find this one a bit too frustrating to be enjoyable. It's hard to actually avoid anything with this frickin' guy. You do get continues, mind you, something of a novelty at this time. Lastly, here's another one I like called The Hand by Tick, although it's also known as Gotya. It's very obscure and it appears that this was Tick's only game, at least under that name. This seems typical at first, but the standout mechanic is Janken. You use the power pellets to change the hand, and then you can either defeat or draw against the enemy hands based on traditional Janken rock, paper, scissors rules. Actually, another thing that's very cool is that when you eat all the dots, the screen scrolls upwards and you actually have to escape the old maze and get to the new one. otherwise you lose a life. I like that mechanic a hell of a lot, actually. Unfortunately, the game is very easy for an arcade title, but the hand's got some very neat little ideas about it that I'd have loved to see in a title that's a bit more refined and challenging. Our last 4 titles see us hit up classic American studios. And first up, we're going back to Exidy. Mousetrap is totally decent, but they've got a much better and more interesting game from 1981 that sadly seems to be a little forgotten nowadays. Venture. This title was created by one of Exidy's top talents, that being Howell Ivey, who first scored a hit at the company in 1975 when he created the successful and very controversial Death Race, and he also headed up Mousetrap, which we saw earlier. Going by a 2014 Retro Gamer interview with Paul Drury, Venture was a project that Ivy picked up from someone else who'd only just started it, and it was very much inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. You play as this fella called Winky, you make your way into different rooms, and you retrieve treasure. Naturally, all the rooms have enemies and traps that you need to avoid, and you can defeat those monsters using arrows. However, they can be very slippy and very capable of avoiding your shots. There's big unkillable monsters that travel along the halls of the floor that must be avoided, and you move to the next floor once you've finished each room and ticked the treasures off your list. The wild thing really is just how much all of this sounds like Gauntlet, and yet Venture predates Atari's game by 4 whole years. Hell, as far as being an arcade game with an adventure element goes, it predates Namco's Tower of Jiraga by 3 years. In practice, the game plays like a more advanced take on Stern's Berserk, and that's totally fine. But in this instance, it's a real freaking shame that this title is damn near forgotten nowadays, even if it did get home ports to the 2600, ColecoVision and Intellivision. Venture is doing things here that later games would have become legendary for, way before they did them. Now, I'm certainly not saying it's better than Gauntlet or Jiraga, but it is absolutely laying the groundwork. You should definitely go and play this one. Here's the first game we're looking at from the almighty Stern, and it's Armoured Car. I possibly could have looked at Stern in the first video by covering Berserk, but I felt that game was just too frickin' big and monolithic to be included there. So we've got this one. It's another top-down title, just like damn near every other game from 1981, although it's not exactly Pac-Man-esque. Instead, we're on the road, picking up money that we need to take to the bank, and trying to avoid ne'er-do-well robbers who are looking to intercept our vehicle, not to mention any other cars like ambulances or street sweepers that might get in the way. Our main deterrent comes in the shape of sawhorses that we can stick on the road behind us for enemies to crash into, but you only get a few of them, so you want to make sure that they're effective. You'll also need to watch the fuel and get gas whenever you're able to, and being that this is a city, you've also got to be mindful of the traffic light system. It's not good at all to be stopped at a red light when you've got all these crims after you. This is quite a tough game, as Stern's games often are, but especially when compared to so many other top-down titles from this time, it's got a whole lot of very cool ideas going for it. Chris Oberth, the main man behind this game, made this as his first title for Stern, and he mentions in a 2004 interview with Derek Spacement that the game was actually partly inspired by a title we saw in the previous video, that being Exidy's Targ. Having seen that tidbit, there is definitely a resemblance, and it makes for a neat little evolution. Chris Oberth sadly passed away in 2012, although we will be looking at another game of his in the 1982 video. Our last 2 games take us into the world of Vector, and back into the world of Cinematronics. In 1980 we saw 3 Vector games by Tim Skelly, all of which were damn good, and were hits as well. However, in 1981 the fortunes of Cinematronics kind of dipped a bit. Here we've got two games, one of which was a flop, and the other one never got a full release. We'll do the flop title first. This game here is Boxing Bugs, and it's the only colour vector game that Cinematronics fully released. The project was initially called Outpost, and it was started by Scott Bowden, but mostly it was worked on by a guy named Jack Ritter, a one-time hippie who, in his words, spent the late 60s living with strippers in San Francisco. This is a rather kooky and creative game. You play as an arm that rotates around the centre of the screen via a dial, with a boxing glove on one end and a blaster on the other. You use the boxing glove to knock the bugs out before they can push bombs to your location, which is protected initially by an octagon, and you can use the blaster to push those bombs away before they blow you up. If things get really hairy, you can use a panic button to push everything away, although naturally you only get a couple of shots with it. I've seen the game described as an inverse Star Castle, which seems appropriate as Ritter was apparently a big fan of that title, and it's really good. It's a very manic little game, filled with lashings of chaos. The bugs can also be KO'd by the bombs, which is a neat touch, and they can also turn into flies. You've really got to watch out for those as they can punch you out. There's lots of character in the graphics, some cool sound effects, the odd cutscene, a bonus round. It's chock full of features, honestly. Unfortunately, the game just didn't perform at all. Perhaps it was just too out there, or the commercial shine was coming off of Cinematronics' Vector titles by the time this arrived in late 1981. In the end, it appears as though not too many Boxing Bugs cabinets were produced, which is a shame. I really enjoy this, and you should play it. As it's a dial game, you may want to fiddle a little bit with the main settings in order to get the most out of it and stop the controls from being too sensitive, but once you do, well, there's not a whole lot of Vector titles like this one, if any, and for my money it really should have been a hit. Lastly, we have another quite ambitious title. It's War of the Worlds. Appropriate timing, seeing as there's a new film out based on the H.G. Wells classic that is apparently a load of garbage. What we've got here is a Space Invaders-esque game, only with more of an over-the-shoulder view. The enemies come towards the player and scale up, and the enemies in question are the fighting machines from War of the Worlds, the tripods. They fire a laser at you which you can protect yourself from using a shield, and you've got to take their legs out using multiple shots. You want to be quick with the final hit once you've destroyed the machine's legs, as they will very quickly fly away. The timeline is very hazy when it comes to this game, and especially confusing as there are two versions of it, but from what I can gather, the initial Rob Patton version of the game was made in 1979, and it's monochrome with a colour overlay. It didn't test well at all, and it was shelved. A couple of years later, the game was resurrected by Tim Skelly as his last title for Cinematronics, and this would have been a colour vector game. Now if this one had come out, it would have been released as a conversion kit for Star Castle, and it would have come out in 1982. However, when this version of the game appeared at 1982's Amusement and Music Operators Association show, it got another very poor reception, much like the rest of Cinematronics' output at the time. It just didn't do well at all, and honestly, it's easy to see why. It feels a bit too basic, in all honesty, and even with a different viewpoint, it feels a little out of its time. It's certainly not pushing vector arcades forward, and there's not enough action going on. It wasn't particularly good for 1979, and the addition of colour didn't magically make it good in 1981. And so, after this poor reception, War of the Worlds was scrapped entirely. Apparently only 10 or so monochrome machines were made, and there were only a couple of colour vector versions produced. Happily, both the monochrome and colour versions of the game are playable on MAME, even if the game itself isn't much cop. Well, there's a bunch more treasures from 1981. There's plenty more to come with 1982. Indeed, so many that we may well have to bump up the number a little, as 10 is just not enough. We shall see. But until then, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.